This is Director Brzezowski. My satellite says it's 10:01. Thank you for attending the fall meeting of the Drought Interagency Coordinating Group. Before we start, I'd like to ask Nemesis Ortiz-Declet to go over the webinar logistics to assure that our virtual meeting will go as smooth as possible. So Nemesis, can you do that? And then we'll get back to introductions.
Thank you, Director Brzezowski. As you can see,
Thank you, Director Brzezowski. As you can see on the webinar logistics slide, we ask that you please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We would like to avoid any echoing sounds or interruptions when someone else is speaking. If you are a member and would like to speak, please type your name in the chat and we will unmute you, or feel free to unmute yourself. If you are a member of the public, please type your questions and or comments in the chat, and we will read and respond to those throughout the meeting. You can also ask to be unmuted if you prefer to speak to the group. This meeting and everything written in the chat will be recorded. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact ADWR Help Desk at 602-771-8444 or email tickets@azwater.gov. If no meeting attendees have any questions about the webinar logistics, we may continue.
Thanks, Nemesis. So we'll go to the welcome and introductions. We have the agenda up on the screen. Hopefully all of you received the agenda from staff. I'll start by introducing myself, Tom Brzezowski, co-chair of the group. And hopefully with us today, we have Alan Clark, director of the Arizona Division of Emergency Management, the other co-chair of the group. Alan, are you with us today?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Thank you. So this group has met biannually since 2006 to make a recommendation to the governor about whether to maintain the drought emergency declaration, which has been in place since June of 1999. This group is an advisory group to the governor and is composed of over 20 federal and state agencies. After the presentations, we will decide on a recommendation. And when we get to that point, I'll ask Alan to synthesize his thoughts first, then I'll share mine, and then we'll ask for the members to weigh in at that point in time. So we have our series of presenters ready to go. I will ask that members introduce yourselves using the chat box, and Cindy Rule, DWR staff, will read the members' names by the order in which they are received when I ask members to weigh in. So the first presentation is Drought Status Update and Monitoring Technical Committee Activities, and Nancy Seelower, the state climatologist, will give that presentation. Hi, Nancy, and things have certainly changed since last spring, haven't they?
Yes, they have. We were looking really good, and then it all changed really fast. So we'll be looking at that right here. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the last 5 years total water year. We had been looking better in terms of long-term drought because we had some even drier years that had drought. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So we had some pretty good years, and then we had a really bad year in 2018, another good year in 2019. Until last April, we thought 2020 was going to be a really good year as well, but that turned out not to be the case. Go to the next slide. We look at this past water year, and so we have the winter part on the left, and you can see the purples are 200 to 300% of normal. The loser or the part that didn't catch some of the benefit of last winter was north central Arizona, much of Coconino County and a bit of Navajo County. And the rest was a little bit near normal, but we had some areas that were very, very wet, and we thought we were doing great. And then all of a sudden, this monsoon thing happened. And so what you see on the right is the majority of the state looking at really less than 50% of average precipitation for what we would expect for that whole monsoon season. So if you go to the next one, we see the this monsoon, and basically July through September, even April through September, this was the hottest on record for all the temperature on the left. It was the record warmest for all those places, basically in red, and then almost the warmest on record in the places in the orange. When we look at precipitation on the right, the red is the record driest, and the orange is near the record driest, or in the lowest 10th percentile. So you can see it was really significant and pretty much wiped out what we had benefited from over the winter. So if you go to the next slide. So this is kind of the little short-term drought situation that we basically jumped through the last year. Last year we had also a dry summer, and so the gains we had made from the winter were cut back quite a ways, not as bad as this year. And so we ended up with a lot of the state in moderate drought and a little bit of it in severe drought. And only a little portion had no drought. And then we went to February through the winter part of the water year, and we had beat back most of that drought situation except for the northeast quarter of the state. We beat it back a little bit more in March and in April, and then it all just stopped. And so not only did drought came back, it came back with a vengeance. And so now we ended up with part of the state in exceptional drought, which is that really dark purple. So if you go to the next slide, I believe that has the numbers associated. Well, in a minute, I'll have the numbers associated with that. This is the longer term period for the whole time that the drought monitor people have been creating these short term maps. And so you can see sort of how much of percentage of the state is in each category of drought. And as you look at the far right end, you'll see we've now moved toward a large part of that state into extreme drought with some exceptional crawling in. And so we're looking kind of like we did in 2018. I really hope that isn't the case, but Mark's going to update you on where we might go from here. So we go to the next slide. This is the numbers. So a year ago, basically, we had moderate drought in a large part of the state, a little bit of severe drought, but no exceptional or extreme. Winter came, we did really well. Most of the state went back up into the no drought, they're 81%. And then after that happened, we all moved back down toward the other end, which was pretty bad situation. So next slide. So this is long-term drought. So this is more a water resource issue. This looks at 2, 3, and 4 year long-term averages. And so a year ago, we had still, again, as you recall, the northeast part of the state was still in pretty bad situation because they did not benefit from these wet winters. And then we beat that back a little bit from that wet winter, but then the summer just dropped that back again. People were we had so much heat and so much dryness that irrigators were using more water for irrigation. So there was a lot more pumping going on. There was a lot more water use. The vegetation was being stressed. So people were actually having to apply more water than they might normally have because it was so hot. And people were using more, and people were cranking their air conditioning. So we had waters from air generating electricity. So it was a really bad situation. So we have moved back in the wrong direction in terms of our long-term drought. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a long-term situation back from 1895 to now, and you can see that last pile of years here back from the mid-90s, we really have in the smoothed curve there, the binomial curve, that we are really still well below the average for most years. Occasionally we get a wetter year than normal, but they're not coming extreme as we would hope that they would be. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the graphic that the UVA produces, which on the bottom axis, you're looking at monthly amounts. And so we have a really wet month, it'll be a little shot of green, and we have a really dry month, it'll be a little shot of brown or yellow. As you move toward the top of the graph, you're looking at the 60-month long-term longer term average. And so you can see the previous wet period over there on the left where we have green all the way up to the very top. And then when we turned the corner and started the current drought, that disappeared, and we have not had sustained wet periods and wet years, wet months enough to get the green back all the way up into that long-term situation of the 60 months. So we kind of go back and forth a little bit, and at the moment we're looking more dry. One more slide. Okay, so this is the water year 2021 so far. Basically, it's just the month of October. And so there was kind of a little bright spot over there in East Central Arizona. However, if you look at a year ago, I'm an optimist. So if you go to the next slide, this is where we were a year ago. We didn't even have that little sliver over in the East Central part of the state. So I'm an optimist, but I think Mark's about to wipe that out with his talk. And that's really all I have.
Thank you, Nancy. Alan or other members of the group, if you'd like to ask a question or comment, key it up in the chat box.
No questions.
Alan?
Yeah, no questions. Doc, thank you for the update. I love you to death. Sometimes you're not very a happy person when you give us these kind of, but I still like you a lot, and so thank you.
I don't like being the bearer of bad news, but this is what we saw, and I guess Mark's going to probably be the bearer of bad news, not me.
Any other members? Not seeing anything pop up in the chat box. We'll move on to the weather outlook for the summer 2020 and winter 2020 to 2021. Mark O'Malley, lead forecaster for the National Weather Service, and that was quite an introduction by Nancy, Mark, so you have quite a bit to live up to.
Well, thank you very much. Nemesis, is my audio fine on your end?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you well.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Mark O'Malley, National Weather Service and co-chair of the Drought Monitoring and Technical Committee. So if you go on to the my first slide here, unfortunately, the emphasis this winter is going to be La Nina. And anyone who's been around for a while knows La Nina is not necessarily a good sign for precipitation in the winter in Arizona. And what started out the summer as just a small area of cooler than normal Pacific waters has really expanded in intensity and in area. And if this continues over the next several months, our La Nina is going to have a stronger influence on our weather pattern for the winter. And typically what this means is it deflects the jet stream up into the northwest United States, and more often than not sticks high pressure directly over the southwest and leads to drier than normal conditions. So if you go on to the next slide, our La Nina is already well established. And as we can generally expect, it peaks in the middle of the winter and it'll go into the spring before it begins to deteriorate. We are looking at almost certainly a moderate La Nina. On the bottom left, you can see there's a large spread in the forecast models. We could be looking at a strong La Nina when all is said and done. That just means that it's more certain that it will influence our weather pattern. Now, for the Southwest, there's not too much a difference from the impacts between a moderate and a strong event, but we are fairly certain that this La Nina will persist into the spring. Go on to the next slide, please. So the official forecast in the top left shows the odds are definitely tilted towards a warmer than normal winter, 50 to 55% chance in the state of Arizona for January through March. And that matches very well with conceptually when you match up the previous La Nina winters in the top right map. Since 1981, across the southern tier of the U.S., it's generally warmer than average. And in the bottom right, looking at historical La Ninas and the temperatures, there is somewhat of a spread. Some La Ninas are towards the near average temperature-wise, but many are in the much warmer than average temperature side when looking at the winter. Most obvious on this graph is the trend we're seeing. Arizona as a state is warming at over a half a degree per decade. So it's quite evident that as we go forward, we're just getting warmer and warmer. So if I'm betting money, I'm just going to bet that this year continues that trend. So go on to the next slide. Everyone's probably most interested in precipitation. So this is a little bit of an interesting graphic looking back at weak to moderate La Nina winters since 2000. There's been 6 of them, and by and large, they've been drier than average. The reds and the oranges are the drier than average winters. There's a few exceptions on there. 2016-17 was wetter than average for the northern half of Arizona, but still dry for the southern part. So there is some hope out there that we can be close to average precipitation, but really when you look at this, for the majority of Arizona, it's not a great sign. I do also want to point out that for the upper Colorado Basin, it's not quite as certain that we will be drier. There are many La Nina winters that actually do fairly well in the upper part of the basin in western Colorado. So even if Arizona is dry, there's some hope that we could get some decent snow in the upper part of the basin. If you go on to the next slide, this is looking at the 4 strong La Nina winters that we've recently had. And it's, again, the trend is not that much different than the moderate and weak ones, where most of Arizona is typically drier than average, and there's a little bit more of a mix up in the upper basin. So as we go forward to the forecast on the next slide, we can see that the official CPC outlook in the top left is decidedly tilted towards drier than average for most of Arizona. There's quite a gradient, though, going across the state and as you get into the Rockies of how quickly it drops off, and that matches very well with the map on the top right, looking at historical La Ninas, where the southern tier of the states, Arizona and New Mexico, are very strongly influenced by drier weather, but it quickly drops off once you get into some of the Rockies. And looking at the trends on the bottom right, this is the most distinctive trend that we're looking at for La Ninas. The overall historical trend doesn't change, but when you look at the red dots and the red stars are historical La Ninas, there hasn't been an above average or wetter than average La Nina year in Arizona. Many of these are the driest winters we've experienced on record are the La Nina winters. So we can hope that we get one that's closer to average, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that this is a very dry winter going forward. So go on to the next slide. This is just looking at the same graphs, but except for western Colorado climate division in the bottom right. And this exemplifies the fact that you can have some winters in western Colorado that are actually not bad precipitation-wise. So there is a little hope that we can get some snowpack in the upper part of the basin. So go on to the next slide, please. And this is something that I am concerned about given what Nancy showed, the hottest summer on record and also the driest summer on record. It wasn't even for just Arizona, it was for the entire Southwest. We have seen this recently. Luckily, last year we did get some nice soaking rains in November before we got the snowpack. There's no guarantee we're going to see that this year. So I am concerned that even if the upper part of the basin does see near normal snowfall this winter, that some of the spring runoff may be negatively influenced because the initial part of the melt is going to go into soil moisture recharge and not directly into runoff. So this is something we saw several years ago where the spring runoff was a lot less than we expected. So just something to watch out for coming this next spring. And go to the next slide. I think this is my wrap-up slide. Again, the winter really looks like it's tilted towards warmer than normal and drier than normal. That's typically what we see in the La Ninas, and there's nothing this year that points to any exception. We can hope that we get near normal precipitation and hope that it's not as warm as we have seen But again, that's the lower probability outcome. And then I do have concerns about the antecedent dry soils that could impact our runoff in the spring. So with that, go to the last slide, and this is any information if you want to call or email me. And with that, I will take any questions.
Mark, this is Tom. Before I turn to Alan, I saw a question pop up. When you mentioned that we've seen a 0.5 degree per decade warming in Arizona, someone was asking if that's centigrade or Fahrenheit.
That's a 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, and that's per decade. So basically over the past 50 years, we've gone up 2.5 degrees.
Thank you. Alan, got questions or comments?
No questions. Just another another presentation that really gives my heart warmth.
Warmer than normal, you mean?
Warmer than normal, exactly.
Sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
Any members with questions or comments? Then thank you, Mark, and we'll move on to the next agenda item, a Colorado River water supply update. Mark McGinnis from DWR's Colorado Management Section will give us that update. So welcome, Mark. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairs, member of the group. I'm Craig McGinnis with the Colorado River Management Group with ADWR or section, and I will be giving a quick hydrology status update for the Colorado River Basin based on Bureau of Reclamation's October 24-month study, current conditions, and various data and reports from the Colorado Basin River Forecasting Center. Next slide, please. So we'll switch it up and start by comparing snow water equivalent for years 2019 and 2020. We can see that 2020 was not quite as good to us as 2019, yet still above the 1981 to 2010 median. And for the record, much better than what we saw in 2018, although we don't have it on this graph. We can quickly note that whilst we track slightly above median figures, runoff progressed earlier in 2020 than both the median and the favorable 2019 season. Next slide, please. You can see reservoir elevations throughout the basin as compared to this time last year, including both Lakes Powell and Meade. As of November 5th, we can see Lake Powell elevation was at 3591.12 feet, with storage at 10.922 million acre feet, or roughly 45%. I took a look at that this morning, and it's down about 0.5 foot, likely as a function, operation function. Lake Meade elevation as of this update was 1081.55 feet with 10.14 million acre feet in storage, or 39%. That has held since Thursday. The end of year projection of Meade based on the August 24-month study is the determining factor for operating conditions in the lower basin. That number was projected to be at 1085.28 feet. So based on that August 24-month study, we're to be in a tier 0 DCP contribution condition for water year 2021. As of November 5th, total system storage was 28.186 million acre feet, or roughly 46% total storage. And after checking that today, that has stayed largely the same within, very close. So next slide, please. So based on the data from the Colorado Basin River Forecasting Center, or CBRSC, we can see the observed and forecasted unregulated inflow into Lake Powell through the rest of the calendar year into January 2021. Observed inflow for April through July of 2020 was 3.758 million acre feet, or 52% of average, which tracked real close to the 54% observed for the entire water year at 5.848 million acre feet. It's difficult to get through the first row of the rather uninspiring month of October, coming in at 18% of average. But on the brighter side, as of November through January forecast, they look to be slightly better at 53, 69, and 66% of average, respectively. We got a report from Bureau of Reclamation River Ops yesterday, and the unregulated inflow forecast for 21 looked to be the water year at 6.791 million acre feet at 63% of average, and the April through July of 2021 looking to be at 4.55 at 64%. So yes, next slide, please. Moving on to projections for the end of calendar year 2020. These figures are derived from the Bureau of Reclamation's October 24-month study. They dropped the November 24-month study on us at 10 o'clock sharp this morning, so I apologize for that. Lake Powell is projected to be at elevation 3584.57 feet with 10.34 million acre feet in storage at 43% of capacity. Lake Mead is projected to be at 1084.99 feet with 10.43 million acre feet in storage and sitting at 40% of capacity. Noting quickly that this projection scenario is based on the 8.23 million acre feet release from Lake Powell in water year 2020 and the projected 9.0 million acre feet release in water year 2021. Next slide, please. So we can see the Lake Powell forecasted inflow for water year 2021 with the 2020 observed inflows up in the top right corner. Based on the forecast released October 1st, on this slide, we can see the most probable, minimum probable, and maximum probable are as follows. The October most probable inflow of 7.90 million acre feet at 73%. The October minimum probable inflow of 5.17, which is 48%, and the October maximum probable inflow of 16.0 million acre feet, or 148%, and we can keep our fingers crossed. For those who aren't necessarily versed in the hydrology of forecasting, I imagine most of you probably are, the min to max range represents the 10th to 90th percentile of model projections. So on the chart, we can see how the 2020 observed inflow of 5.85 million acre feet compares to the years since 1964, as well as how the min, most, and max 2020 forecasts would compare. Next slide, please. In recognition of Lake Powell projections as they affect operations on the river, it's worth noting that the August 24-month study projected end-of-year Powell elevation to be below the 2021 equalization elevation of 3659 feet and above elevation 3575. This means that Lake Powell operations in water year 2021 will be governed by the upper elevation balancing tier with an initial water year release volume of 8.23 million acre feet and the potential for an April adjustment in 2021. This October 24-month study indicated that an April adjustment to balancing releases is projected to occur with a release not more than 9.0 million acre feet, not less than 8.23. Based on the most probable inflow forecast, this October 24-month study projects a balancing release of 9.0 million acre feet in water year 2021, and we will see how the November looks once we get into the weeds on that. So next slide, please. So as we look into the future Lake Mead projections as outlined in the October 24-month study, again, we see the min and max range of projections through the end of water year 2022 on the screen. Again, the Lake Mead end of year projections as of the August 24-month study was at 1085.28 feet, which puts us in the tier 0 DCP contribution condition for water year 2021. Projections from the October study projects Mead to be above 1075 and below 1090 for both calendar years 2020 and 2021. Suggesting we may also be in such a tier 0 condition in water year 2022. Again, don't quote me on that because I haven't seen the November so far. Let's see. This means that Arizona would require DCP contributions of 192,000 acre feet in water year 2021, and under that assumption, the same volume in water year 2022. Next slide. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
First, we'll turn to Alan for questions.
Yeah, Tom, no questions. I didn't follow all the numbers because I'm not a hydrologist, but thank you. It sounded like an alphabet of numbers. Bottom line is what I took away is 60% of anything in school was not good. And I saw a lot of 60s and less than. So, okay, just another exciting and heartfelt presentation on where we're headed. Appreciate it, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other members?
This is Nancy. Do we get to vote? I vote for the max input inflow.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll second that. Can we take a vote? Second your motion. Anyone else? Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, sir.
So we will move on then to the next presentation, item 6 on the agenda. Salt River and Verde River watersheds water supply update. Stephen Flores, senior hydrologist from Salt River Project, will provide that update. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Tom. Everybody hear me now? Yeah, my name is.
We're hearing you well from DVR's end.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here to share an update on Salt River Project's water supply update for the Salt and Verde River watershed. My name is Stephen Flora. I'm a senior hydrologist with our Surface Water and Watershed Management group here at SRP. So I'll start with the good news that we kind of summarized last meeting in the spring. If you go to the next slide, we can see that a year ago at this time, there on the left, we saw SRP total reservoir systems about 66%. In the winter previous in 2019, that had increased due to a wet winter. And going into this beginning of this past water year, we started with a very wet November and December, getting over 7 inches, 7.8 inches of precipitation in November, December, which that's kind of the 7-inch on the watershed. Leading into the winter is when we start to see it get saturated and starting to see more productive. So that was a good start to conditions. Last year, we saw a break in the weather in January and early February, but in late February and into March, we saw the 12th wettest March on record for the Salt and Verde watershed, and that produced 438,000 acre-feet of inflow during the month of March, nearly filling the SRP reservoir system this past winter. So you can see there on the right, kind of the peak storage following this past winter was about 98%. So this was the highest storage on the SRP reservoir system since it was last full in 2010. So overall, with the last two wet winters, we've seen a combination of those winters to nearly fill the SRP reservoir system this May, both on the Verde and just coming nearly full on the Salt and Roosevelt. So that's kind of where the story ends, as many have mentioned already, and things turn dry. So if we go to the next slide. This is what we saw on the Salt and Verde watershed for precipitation during monsoon season. The red line is the normal, the dotted green is last year's monsoon, and the green solid line is this year's monsoon average precipitation across the watershed. And you can see that we only got 1.93 inches of average precipitation across the watershed, which is 30% of normal and the driest on record. And it was the driest by a good margin, over 1.5 inches average precipitation. The previous one was about 3.5 inches in 1973, the previous driest winter. So, and you can also see that the last winter was also fairly dry, or last monsoon was also fairly dry until that September storm boosted it up. So that really dried out conditions across the watershed that we saw following that wet winter. And if we look at what runoff we saw into the watershed, if we go to the next slide, we really saw minimal reservoir inflows during the monsoon season. Now, we don't typically see our higher amounts of inflows that replenish and refill our reservoirs during the summer. So we don't see a lot of increase in reservoir levels during the summer, particularly. But we did see extremely low minimum inflows. We saw both July and September were the second lowest monthly inflows on record, and only by a very small margin. And then August and October were both the lowest monthly inflow amounts on the Salt and Verde on record. And you can see there that the monsoon season, July through September, combined only 32,388 acre-feet. This year was the lowest total monsoon season, and that was again by a fairly wide margin, over 15,000 acre-feet. We really only saw one or two storm events that produced any runoff. In late July, we saw one event, and then in August we saw another event. So essentially inflows were minimal all monsoon season. And Tonto Creek pictured there's a gauge at Tonto Creek, except for that late July storm, that was at 0 CFS flow all monsoon season. Next slide. So if you remember, with the dry conditions in the spring and early summer, we saw some significant fires, particularly the bushfire, impacting a large area of the lower Salt, lower Verde watersheds. The bushfire was 193,000 acres. A couple others, the Salt and the Sears fire over towards the Verde were smaller ones. And then, of course, last year we had the Woodbury fire on the southern portion of the lower Salt reservoir. And so we were concerned about this and did additional monitoring to monitor these burn scar runoff areas because we're working with the Forest Service and Bear team, determined that there's a potential 100% to 200% increase in peak discharge during these flashy monsoon events, and that could potentially have runoff into Sycamore Creek, below our reservoirs, below Bartlett, directly into the Granite Reef and the canals, as well as local inflow into the lower Salt reservoirs. So the bad news is that it was dry. The only upside was that we didn't see any of those large brief flows. We saw one event into Roosevelt on the Salt side from the July event, and then we saw one small event. And you can see pictured here some of the cameras at Sycamore Creek, the picture on the left, and then Cottonwood Creek going into Saguaro Lake. There we saw some small flows from the July or August event, with some debris flows coming down to Granite Reef and into Saguaro, but did not impact operations. So, next slide. So overall, summarizing kind of where we're at, overall, we had the wet winter and the extremely dry summer. It kind of balanced the year totals out to have us just slightly below normal for total precipitation with 16.61 inches or 91% of normal, and slightly above median runoff with 1,058,000 acre feet or 124% of median for total Salt and Verde reservoir inflow. So overall, the water year was near normal or slightly above median for inflows. Again, filled the reservoir system this past winter, but the watershed conditions have significantly dried out, increasing drought conditions across Salt and Verde. Right now, currently, we're about 79% full, or just about 1.8 million acre feet of total storage on the system. Roosevelt is about 83%. Roosevelt's kind of the more long-term gauge to see where we're at in the drought situation. So we're in fairly good shape overall with our reservoirs, near 80%, with Roosevelt being 83%. The Verde reservoirs, we started delivering water off the Verde to bring those down in case we do have winter inflows to store more of that. But if it does continue to be dry, we may have to operate some more off the Salt to balance that water supply. But overall, the reservoir conditions and water supply is in good shape due to the last two wet winters, but watershed conditions have significantly increased in drought conditions due to this summer. I think so. As far as operations, it's also impacted. Our pumping, our groundwater pumping is brought down to minimum due to the higher reservoir storage. So we're reduced our groundwater pumping in the service area. We plan to continue that next year. If this year is dry, that would potentially increase in 2022. Kind of looking at where we're looking to be going through this winter, as Mark mentioned, it's fairly dry. So the next slide. We had a storm come through this last winter, which October was, very minimal, about 10% of normal precipitation. We got, half an inch to an inch on the Verde in some areas, and an inch to 2 inches of precipitation on the Salt in some areas. Overall, in the higher elevations, we saw about an average of 3/4 of an inch. So it helps, but again, a lot of that will melt and run off or infiltrate into the ground due to the dry conditions in the watershed. And as Mark mentioned, we're looking at a fairly drier outlook due to the La Nina conditions. So these on the right here, you can see some projections on Roosevelt. where we're looking at kind of in the 80% range in January starting out. And since we're looking at a fair outlook with La Nina, looking at minimum, lower quartile, and median inflows, you can see as of May, or as of May at the end of the runoff season, if we had minimum, we'd see a slight decrease. If we saw lower quartile, we'd see a slight increase. If we did happen to get a medium runoff, and that would take a lot since we didn't, so it doesn't look like we're having a wet fall to saturate the watershed. Even if we get normal precipitation in the winter, it would take quite a bit more to get a median runoff due to the dry conditions. But if we did get that, we would fill the system if we did get median runoff. But and kind of after the summer, we could be anywhere from at Roosevelt from 60% to 86%, depending on how that. So kind of the minimum would be in that 60% range. So even after one dry winter, conditions would still be fairly decent on the SRP system. It would take another dry winter to really impact to lower SRP reservoirs systems. Next slide. So overall, basically, the two wet winters have helped to refill the SRP system. The record dry monsoon increased drought conditions throughout the salt, so it'll take a lot to kind of get things started this winter with runoff. We had fires that impacted the lower elevation portions, but we didn't see much runoff because we didn't see much monsoon. And then overall, we're still in fairly good shape, just under 80% total storage SRP capacity at the reservoirs. And next slide, I think just if there's any questions, and thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. First, I'll ask Alan.
Yeah, nothing. Thank you, Stephen.
Any other members? So thanks, Stephen. At least you had one tidbit of good information and good hope. That was minimal groundwater pumping for 2021. I'll also observe, if my memory serves me correctly, you had a projection for January 21st, 2021, that Roosevelt was going to be at 2136. I believe that was the elevation of the top of the original Roosevelt, just pointing out the value of raising the dam. Yes. And being able to keep that extra water that we've been able to keep in the SRP system, especially with the dry projections that are coming. So with that, I'll thank you, Stephen, and we'll move on to agenda item 7, 2020 wildfire season update. Tiffany Davila, Public Affairs Officer for the Department of Forestry and Management. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm, of course, having computer difficulties right when I need to give a presentation. But just kind of wanted to get into the 2020 outlook, what our fire managers and our forecasters predicted for this season. The 2020 outlook was going to be similar to 2019. If you could go to the next slide, please. We were going to see high fire activity in the central region, down into southern Arizona and throughout the Sonoran Desert. And that's basically what we saw this year. We saw high fire activity throughout Maricopa County, within the Tonto National Forest, in the Cave Creek area, and then, of course, fire activity down in Pima County in southern Arizona. The winter moisture attributed to the abundance of fine fuel. So the 2019 moisture that we received, all that did was just add basically to the overgrowth of fine fuels that we do have across the Sonoran Desert. Areas with the accumulation of fine fuels, those areas of grasses where we have that high influx of grasses and brush, we're going to see that higher activity. And again, that's what we did see this year. And then again, our above normal spring temperatures impacted the fine fuels. We had very warm temperatures in April, unseasonably warm temperatures for that time of the year. And all that did was dry out those fine fuels faster. Fine fuels don't hold a lot of moisture to begin with. Fine fuels are things like the grass and the brush vegetation. So once those fuels dried out, they dried out very quickly. They dried out early. And that's when we started experiencing our high fire activity. And, you know, we are starting to see fire activity throughout the year. So we really don't want to say we have a fire season anymore because we are constantly seeing fire activity. We've had larger scale fires in January, February, and then of course when we see that peak time at the end of April, beginning of May, when into our monsoon season. But unfortunately, we didn't have that monsoonal moisture this year, so that's why we're continuing to see fire activity at this time of the year. The next slide, please. So the 2020 fire season, you can see how busy we were. We had over 2,300 fires. We average about 1,800 to I'd say about 2,300 fires a year, but it's the amount of acres burned that's off the charts. We've burned about 959,000 acres this year. And you can see compared to the 2017, 2018, and 2019 periods, where we haven't even burned in total compared to what we've burned in 1 year. So very significant large scale of acres burned in due to where they burned. So which areas did they burn? They burned in the central region where we had that overgrowth of fine fuels. Grass fires burn very quickly and they spread very rapidly. So that's why we are seeing the large scale of numbers, our acres burned this year as compared to 2017, 2018, and 2019. I didn't put the number up there, but we have had about 81 to 82% of our fires this year have been human caused. That's a little jump from 2017, 2018, and 2019. If you could go to the next slide, please. So for the 2020 fire season, and I do want to just apologize if some of our slides are, or some of the graphics are similar to others in the group, but we do base obviously our outlooks and our fire activity on the drought conditions, the outlooks that are provided to us by the National Weather Service and such. So the next slide, please. Sorry. Okay, thanks. So just wrap up 20 fire season. These are the larger scale fires that we had this year. The bushfire on the Tonto National Forest was 193,000 acres. It was human caused. The Bighorn fire down on the Coronado, 119,000 acres. And then the Mangum fire on the Kaibab, 71,000 acres. So the bushfire and the Bighorn are the top, in the top 10 fires, larger scale fires for Arizona. And then if we can go to the next slide, please. And then just to reiterate those numbers I showed earlier about the 900,000 acres burned, all of that encompasses state, federal, and tribal land. So that's just not state land, that's our federal land jurisdictions and tribal as well. So these are the top causes of our fire season this year, comparable to every year. But this year, for some reason, we had target shooting in restricted areas, welding, grinding. We had an exploding target out in Pinal County. It was a gender reveal. Abandoned campfires, and then of course we have a majority of roadside fires, obviously along the 17 that get shut down pretty much throughout the summer because of fires, dragging chains, overheating vehicles, and tire blowouts. And just kind of, you know, just to go along with the activity that we've had this year and the lack of moisture and the lack of monsoon season, we're just now lifting fire restrictions tomorrow on state land and federal land as well. So that goes along with, typically we lift fire restrictions once we see that monsoonal moisture in July, because we do get that increase in humidity levels, cooler temperatures, that helps decrease fire activity. But because we didn't have, you know, hardly any monsoonal moisture this year. We had the wind, we had the lightning, but we didn't have any of that precipitation to follow up. We left fire restrictions in place just because of the amount of activity that we were continuing to see through the late summer and into the fall. If you'll go to the next slide, please. For the 2020 fall winter outlook, again, you know, we could potentially have and did have in August, September, ongoing large fire activity. We had the horse fire last month. Again, La Nina and the current fuel conditions are going to be the main drivers of significant fire activity through the fall and into the winter. Again, as we all know, this is why we're here. Drought conditions expected to continue for much of California, Arizona, the Great Basin. Fire activity and potential will likely diminish across the western U.S., except for portions of California. We have seen a decrease in our fire activity here. We are still responding to calls every day, whether that's a 5-acre fire or a 10-acre fire. The difference now is we're able to suppress those fires faster because the temperatures obviously are cooler. But again, it is likely we could still see fire activity into December. And then, of course, we're going to have the same pattern next year because we're going to have a lack of moisture due to La Nina. And then again, while fire activity is predicted to decrease, it has decreased. Our fire management officers, our fire behavior analysts expect we could see activity through December. And then if you could go to the next slide, please. For the fall winter outlook, again, I hate to keep repeating, but the near-term forecast is for warm and dry conditions for Arizona. Obviously not good news for us. Temperature currently forecasted at 60% chance of above normal. Precipitation forecast for 40 to 50% chance of below normal for the state. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword for us. We get all of this moisture in the winter. We see this moisture in the spring. And then all that does is just give us more of that fine fuel across the state. So if anyone's driven up the 87 lately and has seen the bushfire scar, you'll see that the grasses are growing back. So, again, we get all of this moisture, this much needed moisture in the winter. We get this overgrowth of fine fuel. We don't get any moisture, and all we're seeing is just dry vegetation across the state, pretty much at the kindling stage. So again, this is why we stress the importance of the one spark messaging, because one spark is really all it takes to start a fast moving wildfire. Again, we'll limit the growth of grasses because of the lack of moisture this winter, or the predicted lack of moisture. We'll stress the existing vegetation due to the lack of moisture. And then our dead fuels will continue to be very dry and available for fire in most areas. And then if you could go to the next slide, please. Temperatures for spring are slightly better, with Arizona having improved to 50% chance of above normal temperatures. So again, we're still going to see the warmer temperatures. Sorry, the lights go out in my office frequently. So we're still going to see warmer than normal temperatures. Not a good forecast for us for the 2021 season. Spring looks very dry, with the 50% below probability having expanded to most of the state. These conditions, if they pan out, could lead to an early start to an active fire season. And of course, any windy conditions would enhance the fire conditions. So basically, we're looking at a cookie cutter season. If we don't receive any moisture or heavy moisture, we're really going to need a downpour of moisture across the central region of the state. We know we're seeing snow up in the high country right now, but we're really going to need a lot of moisture across the central region throughout the Sonoran Desert to really help us improve conditions. Otherwise, we could see high fire activity early on again come 2021, the spring of 2021. And that is all I have for you. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Tiffany. We'll start with Alan.
Tiffany, thanks. No, I appreciate it. We were hand in hand with DFFM all summer long on filling EMAC requests to California and assisting the National Guard, assisting with airdrops and those kind of things. So we were partnered with them throughout and continue to be partnered with them. I think it's interesting that we hate talking COVID, but we have to, and that's the fact that a lot of people turned to the outdoors to get out when they couldn't go anywhere else, and that really exasperated the seasons and use of and fire starts and everything else, as Tiffany mentioned. And I don't foresee that changing, especially through the winter months. So we're going to see a whole lot more people out in the outdoors. I mean, anybody who's tried to buy a bike lately, good luck on that. So anyways, don't see much relief. Tiffany, thank you. As always, wonderful briefing, and we'll be there with you through it all.
Thank you.
Any other members? So I'll just add that the directors of state agencies regularly have meetings virtual meetings with the governor's office back to last March when COVID started, and just about the only thing we talk about besides COVID are updates from Director Tenney on the fire situation through last spring, through the summer, and into this early fall. So even if folks are not aware of the numbers, clearly it's a huge issue, and to share that with the state agency directors on that regular basis is really telling about how serious this issue is for the state. So with that, we can move on then to the next item, number 8, impacts of drought on wildlife. Dave Weedman from the Aquatic Habitat Program Manager with Arizona Game and Fish will give us that presentation. Dave.
Good morning, Mr. Director. Thank you. Thanks for everybody for letting me be a part of this. With Fish and Wildlife, we generally don't provide much of an outlook. My presentations to you have been looking kind of backwards at how the drought has impacted existing fish and wildlife populations across the state. Present now. If we can go to the next slide, touch on a couple of different anecdotal areas where I was able to get some feedback from the agency on how this past year's precipitation and then lack of precipitation later in the year affected some various things. 4 areas. One, water hauling. I think you hear about that every 6 months from us, whether or not we have to haul a lot of water or we don't. Some specific information on spring snail populations, which are an invertebrate that lives in springs and require water to survive. Then some impacts to wetlands up near Flagstaff, and lastly, some of our smaller reservoirs around the state that suffer from some low water conditions. Next slide, please. Got some numbers from a couple of regions across the state. The Flagstaff region up on the North Kaibab, north of the Grand Canyon, hauled about 12,000 gallons of water to various drinkers in that area. Just since July, the Tucson region has hauled 31,000 gallons to 55 different water catchments as a result of the drought across the Sonoran Desert and the lower elevations. Specifically, that lack of monsoon season really caused most of our water catchments to dry up. And then lastly, the Mesa region, they reported only hauling about 15,000 gallons. But this ongoing drought over many years continues to force us to redesign our water catchments across the state, of which we have hundreds, to hold a little bit more water and to capture water more efficiently. So the department continues to spend money to improve the performance of those water catchments across the state. The next slide, please. I mentioned the spring snails. Grand Wash is a tributary to Lake Mead, flows north into Lake Mead. There's a Grand Wash spring snail that lived in some isolated springs along the edges of Grand Wash. And this past year, for the first time, several springs dried up. These were springs that fed cattle troughs also. And as a result of those springs drying up, we lost these populations of a Grand Wash spring snail, which could potentially contribute to their listing as endangered species. But it also affected the rancher that was relying on these troughs for water for his cattle. Next slide, please. Up in the Flagstaff region, they reported to me that a lot of their smaller sized wetlands, as a result of the lack of precipitation through the monsoon season, were dry. And those small wetlands provide habitat for migrating waterfowl, which is a popular and well-used source of recreation for duck hunters. They use those small wetlands and hunt over them when the ducks come through in the late fall, early winter, and in January as they're migrating. So the precipitation is affecting the ability for those folks to recreate. And then up on the Arizona Strip, north of the Grand Canyon, somebody mentioned earlier the Mangum fire. It destroyed 13 of our water catchments, and we're working with partners to rebuild them. And as I mentioned earlier, they've also had to haul 12,000 gallons of water up there to keep some water on the landscape for the wildlife. Next slide, please. And I mentioned the smaller reservoirs around Arizona. Low precipitation years, a lot of our smaller reservoirs rely on frequent precipitation to maintain water levels. And the inflow also refreshes the water quality and keeps the water quality suitable for fish to survive. The department this past year invested $180,000 on an aeration system up at Luna Lake near Alpine to maintain dissolved oxygen through the late summer and early fall that had been causing periodic fish kills in that lake. The decrease in inflow to lakes also results in an increased nutrient loading, contributing to these dissolved oxygen problems. This is just one example of several lakes in the White Mountains where we're having water quality issues affecting fisheries, and we're starting to design some fixes to these symptoms. Next slide, please. There we go. Some of the other issues with the low water and high mountain lakes and the water quality causes a high pH, and it prevents us from stocking trout in the summertime. Somebody mentioned the amount of outdoor activity ongoing since COVID hit. This year, the department has experienced its highest increase in fishing license sales, I believe, across all years historically, as a result of COVID and people not having too much recreation opportunity. They really wanted to get outdoors and go fishing. And in some of these lakes, we had problems stocking fish to give them something to do while they're in the outdoors. Nelson Lake, Luna, Carnero, which also suffered a small fish kill, Crescent Lake, River Tunnel and Bunch reservoirs near Greer, Halsey, and Big Lake. And those lakes are some of our most popular fishing lakes in the summertime. And periodically we weren't able to stock fish in there and keep the recreational opportunity going for those folks. Next slide. I do believe that was the last one. Yeah, so I didn't have a question slide, but I'd be happy to take any questions. I do want to mention one thing real quick. Anecdotally, as there's a drought on the landscape and the availability of water minimizes, we've also been experiencing some increased human-wildlife interactions, primarily accidents, as deer and elk and other large-bodied mammals start moving around trying to find water. We've detected an increase in the accident rate between vehicles and wildlife. So lastly, I'll be glad to take any questions folks might have.
Thanks, Dave. We'll start with Alan.
Yeah, nothing, Dave, from State Emergency Management. Thank you. Also, as an avid outdoorsman, appreciate all of the efforts to keep things going. And as a citizen of Arizona, I will continue to do what I can. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alan.
Members of the group, anything for Dave? Not seeing anything. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
We'll move on to item 9, impacts of drought on the Navajo Nation. Carly McClellan, senior hydrologist, Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, will give us the presentation. Welcome, Carly. So we are seeing your presentation, but we are not hearing you at this point.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Carly McClellan, senior hydrologist with Navajo Nation Water Management Branch. So just real quick, we can just jump right in. Next slide. So just to give you a little bit of background for those who may not be too familiar with our water monitoring inventory program. We do a lot of surface water monitoring, and the things that we've done in the past have at times went towards technical support for litigation and water rights stuff. We just, of course, do monitoring the surface water by means of snow surveys, stream gauging, precipitation monitoring, and climate action. And so, we do provide information here and there when needed. Then we do maintain the data in a database as best as we possibly can. Next slide. So altogether, we have a total of 85 rain cans, and that's just a breakdown. I'm not going to go into that, but next slide. So this is a map of the Navajo Nation, and you can see the kind of like the light green to the far left. That is Western Agency. The light blue at the very top is Shiprock Agency. The pink right in the middle is Chinle Agency. The tan is Fort Defiance Agency, and the far right, kind of like the darker colored blue, that's the Eastern Agency. So, and you can see the breakdown of where all the rain cans are scattered. And you'll see that we have most of our rain cans scattered throughout the Cheska Mountain Range. We try to scatter them based off of elevation, climate, and various things. So you can see there's less rain cans towards the west and east. But that's just, I just wanted to make note on that. Next slide. So, part of the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the things that we've been affected by tremendously is, closures, of course, and from those closures, there have been times when during this pandemic outbreak, that we have not been consistently collecting data. So we do have like a lot of holes in our data. So it's like Swiss cheese, and we're trying to piece things together. So normally I do include a lot of our in situ data, but being that I'm still working on piecing a lot of those together, I also decided to change it up a little bit and also feature something that we've been working on with NASA for the past few years. And it's a tool known as DSET. It's a spinoff of Climate Engine. And we've been developing and designing this tool for quite some time. And we've finally launched it as of maybe about a month and a half ago. So I just wanted to share basically, it's Climate Engine, if those of you are familiar with it, but it's customized to a lot of our administrative boundaries. So what I did was I did some queries, and I pulled up the 6-month SBI grid met by agencies from the beginning of the year to end of October. Next slide. So you can see here, this is Chinle Agency, and you can see the 6-month SBI, and you can see the downward trend. You get to see how it's bottomed out and from September on. Next slide. And Eastern Navajo. I also wanted to make note that this DSET tool, although in a lot of this is remote sensing satellite data, we've also kind of done our own method validation, so to speak, quasi-method validation, where we compared our rain gauge data against the remote sensing data. And they're actually pretty close. I just wanted to make note of that. This is Eastern Navajo, or Eastern Agency. You can see, again, that same downward trend in the 6-month SBI. Next slide. Fort Defiance Agency, again, same, we bottomed out since September. Next slide. This is Shiprock Agency, again, same pattern. We had a little bit of a peak there for the monsoons there in between July and August, but late July and August. You saw that in one of the other previous slides, but next slide. Again, Western Navajo. We didn't really see much in terms of a major contribution from the monsoons. We did get some monsoon rains in the western Navajo, but again, pretty much you see that same downward trend. Next slide. Okay, so this here, again, this is still using the DSET tool, and this is the precipitation numbers that are determined by CHIRPS, which is Climate Hazard Infrared Precipitation Standard, I believe, and it was by agency from the beginning of the year to the 31st. Next slide. And again, you could see the precipitation in inches of from for Chinle agency, and you can see some of the peaks and the spikes and the different storms that have come through. Next slide. Eastern Navajo, and just we saw some effects from the snow season. You could see some of these snowstorms, and you could see some of these peaks coming from the monsoons and whatnot, and some of these late storms that we had. Next slide. That was Eastern Navajo. This is Fort Defiance, and next slide. And this is Shiprock again. Next slide. This is Western Navajo. And next slide. So I just wanted to share some of those the precipitation by agencies. So this here, this is just our provisional data, and we're still working on fine tuning and making corrections, and so. But this is a map of our 9 stream gauges that we have. Most of them are scattered throughout the Cheska Mountain ranges and the Defiance Plateau, and of course we have one in Chinle Wash there. Okay, next slide. So again, these are the gauge heights, the stage in feet, and so you can see this is the hydrograph for Asayat, which is Bull Canyon, and you can see where the numbers are, 1, 2, 3, all the way number through 8. Those are site visits. We don't really have a clean baseline just because we're still working the record and making corrections. So next slide. But I just wanted to make note before you go. You can go back to one slide if you could. I just wanted to make note that we see this our base flow pretty much bottomed out, and we're really kind of not seeing much in terms of flow and precipitation just because of the ongoing drought. I primarily wanted to just include these slides just to show our stream flow diminishing. Next slide. This one here is Black Creek, and again, you can see that our baseline looks horrible right now. But you could see the base flow just bottomed out, and we're just kind of still on this downward trend here. Next slide. And this one here is Captain Tom. There's pretty much no flow since early June. Next slide. And this is Chinle Wash. Again, most of these are pretty much no flow from May, from maybe about the middle of May to the end of September. That's pretty much no flow. Once all this is corrected, you'll see a little bit of flow from the snow melt, but once all that washed down the stream, it's been dry. Next slide. This is Kinfachee Creek, and this one here, I'm not really sure, but we have this is one of our perennial, and usually it's a slow trickle, so it'll be interesting just to see how that's going to look once we clean it up. But next slide. And this one's Lukachika Creek. Again, you can see pretty much our diminishing stream flow. A lot of this is just kind of some noise. I think once we clean that up, it'll pretty much be just a flat no flow or little flow. Let's look at Chigay Creek. Okay, next slide. And this is Saley Creek. Again, we had a little bit of a flow from monsoons, but then pretty much just dried out after that. Next slide. And this is wheat fields. Again, you know, of course, there's not much. Just everything's just kind of diminishing. Same trend all over. So next slide. And this is Whiskey Creek. Again, you know, you see a lot of the same pattern. Next slide. So some of the drought vulnerability that the Navajo Nation has faced, it's affected a number of different people and different areas. And so, you know, some of the things that it definitely affects are the domestic water haulers. But I threw COVID-19 pandemic in there just because it's really affected Navajo people, generally speaking. It's kind of done, it's done a number on us, so to speak. And so I just threw that in there just because we've been feeling the effects of it from the pandemic. And of course, you know, some of the things, you know, that's affected is static water level for the public drinking water supplies and irrigators and dryland farmers, livestock and wildlife and whatnot. So next slide. Just kind of wanted to just give a quick overview as well too, that we do have a drought contingency plan. I think going forward, we've been talking about, you know, eventually sometime down the road revising and updating this 2003 drought contingency plan. But, you know, I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but, you know, basically they're just guidelines for the Navajo Nation to follow in the event of a drought. So next slide. Again, this page is actually coming from the drought contingency plan, and it's just the flow chart that we follow. It's similar to the U.S. Drought Monitor, the D0, D1, D2, all the way to D4, and so. But you know, it's just a flow chart of, like, you know, what to do, and so the different drought stages and that how we label them. So next slide. And again, this is just extreme drought is if the SPI is less than 1.5. I also do want to share that over the summer, the Navajo Nation Commissioners on Emergency Management, they did reaffirm the existing drought declaration. So just wanted to make note of that. Next slide. Then I just wanted to close with the most current U.S. drought monitor. You could see that we are, you know, still pretty affected with all the D3, D4 in the Four Corners region there. So hopefully we get, you know, some additional precip here. We did have a little bit of storms that have come through over the past few days, and so. Hopefully that will be enough to kind of somewhat sustain or alleviate some of the drought conditions that we're facing. So last slide. And that's just my contact information if anyone needs to reach out to me, my phone number and email. But if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer what I can.
Thank you, Carly. First, we'll turn to Alan.
Carly, thank you. No questions. Thank you for the presentation, sir.
Any members of the group? Seeing and hearing none, thank you again, Carly, and we will move on to our action item number 10 on the agenda, the drought declaration recommendation. Again, as an advisory body to the governor, the group will now consider the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee's updates, the water supply conditions, drought impacts, all the information we've heard here today, and make a recommendation as to whether or not we should the governor should maintain the drought emergency declaration. I will say at the end of the monsoon, there was lots of media attention. I know I saw Nancy on TV. I was on TV. We got lots of inquiries from the media. Folks paying attention to the record temperatures and to the record lack of precipitation for the monsoon. So I think there's going to be lots of eyes on this moving forward as well. So I'll first turn to Alan for his thoughts and recommendations, and then we'll have further discussion. So Alan, please give us your thoughts.
Yeah, Tom, thank you. This year, to kind of add on to what's already been discussed, did a lot of work with the governor's office, or some work with the governor's office, on helping farmers and growers and everybody around the state as they were looking for assistance. A lot of not only related to the wildland fires or the wildfires, but also related to the drought situation. So not to belabor this, my recommendation is that we keep everything in place as far as emergency declarations that we have, because I think we're a long ways from being out of this situation.
Thanks, Alan. It's a good point. The drought declaration does maintain the state's ability to provide emergency response and to receive federal assistance for some of the things you just described. And so I do not want to cut any discussion out in terms of what we've heard today, but it seems to me to be pretty much a slam dunk that we should recommend to the governor that the drought declaration remain in place. We've heard nothing today but dire projections about how dry it has been, dire projections about how dry it's going to be. We heard about how dry it has been. I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel that would lead us to a conclusion that the declaration should go away. Even last spring, when we did have a bit of a decision point for the first time in a while, we took the conservative path, knowing how much uncertainty there was and recognizing really the long-term drought that we've seen and the long-term drought impacts. So I will open it up to the group for further discussion, but if I do not hear anything, I will assume that silence is agreement that we should have staff prepare a letter of recommendation to the governor for continuing the declaration. So I'll open it up to the members. Chat or ask Cindy to unmute you if you'd like to speak.
This is Nancy. I was hoping in spring that we were moving in the right direction. I knew we weren't there yet, obviously, but now we're moving back in the wrong direction. So absolutely, for sure, we should continue.
Thanks, Nancy. Anyone else?
This is Carl McClellan. I'm in favor of keeping the drought declaration in place.
Thank you.
This is Ray Malner, sitting for Mayor, also in agreement to continue the drought plan.
Thank you.
Susan Chase, Arizona Department of Agriculture, agreed, maintain the declaration.
Will do, thank you.
Yeah, this is Stephen Flora with SRP. I would just agree as well, even with higher reservoir conditions. SRP overall, I think with the summer would continue the drought conditions.
Thanks, Steve. So one of the difficulties is maintaining the proper pause to let people jump in. So anyone else for weighing in? Members of the group. So we will go ahead then and direct staff to prepare that recommendation letter to the governor. And we'll move on then to item 11, comments on the 2020 Arizona Drought Preparedness Annual Report. DWR is required to submit an annual drought report to the governor's office by the end of the fiscal year for the previous water year. This 2020 drought report covers the drought conditions and preparedness activities for this water year, October 1, 2019 through September 30th, 2020. It includes a summary of Arizona's drought status this past water year, outlook for the next water year, as drought designation information, and highlights of the drought conditions and preparedness activities, including water supply, the MTC and ICG efforts, drought planning for community water systems, local drought impact group activities, and outreach education, participation in regional and national efforts, and assistance programs. And we thank already those who provided updates to the report. We did send it to the group last week for review and comment. We have a preview of the new design up on the screen here. So I guess, are there any other additional comments or questions for us to consider as we finalize this report for submittal to the governor's office along with the drought declaration recommendation letter? So again, I'll open it up to first Alan and then members. Alan?
Yeah, Tom, no additional recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Anyone else? And again, you can, in the near term here, still submit comments to the staff, but we'd like to button this up pretty quickly here. So with that, hearing no additional comments, we are on to a call to the public. Anybody from the public has comments to present to the group on the agenda items we talked about today, please type them in the chat box or ask to be unmuted if you wish to speak to the group. And I'll pause a bit to give folks time to do that. I am not seeing anything pop up in the chat box. Cindy, are there any comments or requests to unmute?
No, Director. I see none.
All right, thank you. So with that, I want to thank all of you for the presentations today. I want to thank all of you for your participation and attention. And we hope we'll see all of you in our spring meeting in May of 2021, and we will hope and be hopeful that things might improve between now and May when we meet again. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day and stay safe.